When I read this title, Explained, I was reminded of I spent a week in Lebanon 2 months ago, and I met an archaeologist who said to me that if you meet people and they start talking about the Lebanese civil war, and then they said that now you understand, I have explained it, then you are certain of one thing: they've got something wrong. Because the Lebanese civil war is not, for many of us, not explainable. The reason, of course, is that the complexities in Lebanon derive very much from the fact that other countries fought their wars in Lebanon through local proxies, which to some extent, even though there is a war, they are still doing. And they still feel the pressure not only of Israel and what is happening across the border of Syria, but very much so from the Americans and the Iranians as well. So they will not be able to agree on their recent political history. The National Museum in Beirut, which is a fantastic museum, does not contain anything on recent Lebanese history. The history book, they cannot agree on how to write them. So the fate of Lebanon, of course, depends still very much on the policies of other countries. Bringing us then to Sudan, there has always been an international dimension of some measure then in Sudanese conflicts, the third-party involvement. Because there are several states in the neighborhood that perceive their national interests to be affected by developments within Sudan. And the country has also been much affected by and having been marked as well by the Americans as a country which sponsors terrorism. And was therefore for a long time, and still is to some extent, subject to US sanctions. And I will come back to all this because this regional dimension and the international dimension is important for what is happening in Sudan these days. First, very briefly on some political history of Sudan. I would say that like Alex de Waal, who gave the Christian Michelsen lecture, I think in 2010 or 2009, said that Sudan, since independence in 1956, has suffered from perpetual turbulence. The two main themes that have dominated these political developments have been, first, persistent attempts, actually by all governments, whether they are civilian or military, to unite the different peoples and regions of Sudan around Islam and Arabism. All governments have pursued this object. It has been accompanied by a centralization of power, very much using the state as a tool to promote special interests, and the Sudan has been governed by a narrow group of people, an elite being recruited from 2-3 different ethnic groups in the Nile Valley around Khartoum and north of Khartoum. There has been militarization and authoritarian regimes. The second theme is the also persistent attempts of the Sudan's peripheries to against these Khartoum-made policies. But for a long time, these regional movements lost much of their power because their leaders were bought up, co-opted by the governments in Khartoum, given positions and cars, Mercedes cars and so on. Until South Sudan, when SPLA was an SPLM, Sudan People's Liberation Movement, was established fully in 1983, they launched their own state-building project, which led to the independence later of South Sudan in 2011. But before then, Darfur had also erupted, in very serious conflict. Through 2003 and 2004, Darfur was the most severe humanitarian crisis in the world. And some of you will know that famous people like George Clooney and Maya Farrow engaged very much in this through the Save Darfur movement, and they are still very much involved in what's happening in Sudan. It became actually a domestic issue in the US because of the involvement of these famous people. George Bush had to engage. But we got then in Sudan over a long period of time an increasingly polarized and violent political environment. Instability at the center also, and very much unequal development. And this is how this perpetual turbulence continued for a long number of years. And it was very much intensified 30 years ago when the National Islamic Front came to power through a coup assisted by the military in July 1989. Once in power, these new rulers made it clear that no individual or group would interfere with the implementation of their Islamic project, which they call a civilizational project. The loyalty was emphasized over qualifications. We have friends who lost their jobs at the University of Khartoum, for example. And there was a fusion of the interests of army officers, Islamic businessmen, and members of the ruling party. The Sudan economy became their private property in a way. They took over all the command positions of the Sudanese economy, and they were actually able to do much of it before they staged the coup by dominating the Islamic banking system, and then, of course, the insurance companies. And when they came to power, the old capitalists also lost out, including the Norwegian Consul General Tal Ruby, who had a big fleet of lorries and was involved at the battery factory. But he was one of these old capitalists losing out to new Islamic capitalists who got their contracts and their licenses because they were loyal to this new government. And over time, and to make it short, Omar al-Bashir came to be on top of a big pyramid, you could say, where positions were and money were circulating, licenses were given, contracts were given, and so on and so forth. And this was fine for Omar al-Bashir until South Sudan became independent in 2011, because oil was found in Sudan in early 1990s, and this gave export income, high export incomes. But when South Sudan became independent, Sudan lost 70% of its export income. And this corruption pyramid had to be funded from somewhere else, and somewhere else, that was the Gulf. That was mainly Saudi Arabia and that small but very, very rich country, Qatar, by the way, being in stark conflict with each other, which I will come back to. So the fact that he was funded from outside is a very important aspect of the Sudanese tragedy so far, but we will see what will happen. Over the past few years, it became increasingly clear that Bashir was doing everything to consolidate his power and prevent any possible conspiracy against his presidency. On the foreign policy front, he was trying to reach out to anyone who could guarantee the security of his regime. The US actually eased their sanctions in October 2017, but still made it clear that Sudan had not yet made all the steps to have them all removed, and including removing them from the list of countries supporting terrorism. Although the US and the Sudan have collaborated for a number of years on issues of terrorism, actually. It was Sudan that also handed over the so-called Chacal, the French, to the French government many, many years ago. Bashir became quite desperate. As his diplomats were engaging with the US to ease the rest of the sanctions, he actually went to Moscow and asked the Russians to protect him from the Americans. He also continued to deal with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia on one side and Qatar and Turkey on the other side, hoping to secure their support. Actually, and this was of course a great issue for Saudi Arabia and Egypt, he more or less promised that, I think he wrote something also to the effect that he promised the old important city of Suakin, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, that the Turks could not only rehabilitate it, but it was also implied that they could have some kind of navy base there, which was not popular across the Red Sea. On the home front, and he was balancing between Qatar on the one side and Emirates and Saudi Arabia on the other side. I guess most of you will know about this very, very deep and serious conflict. Qatar Airways used to have 14 flights a week on Khartoum, but as this conflict started, they had to come around all the way into the Indian Ocean and then to Khartoum, which took many, many hours more. But they still, for a long time, continued 14 flights a week because they were closely linked with the Khartoum regime. This has something to do with their relationship with the Muslim brothers in the Middle East. I will try to come back to this. Whereas the Saudis and the Emirates were blockading and preventing Qatar from using any of their territory, and so on and so forth. And this goes on still. On the home front, he undertook a number of reshuffles. He had always been reshuffling. There were three, and still are, three armed forces in Sudan. You have the regular army, and then you have the Sudan security forces, and then a third force, which was recruited from the old Janjaweed, if you remember the Janjaweed in Darfur, Arab forces or Arab militias. He was reshuffling leadership positions in order to maintain loyalty and prevent any coup attempts. But in this process, of course, he alienated a number of different factions, also within the regime and within his own parties. Important commanders within the security sector were removed, and also in the military. He also angered members of his ruling party, the National Congress Party, when he declared he was a national figure that stood above all political parties in Sudan. Most importantly, of course, he alienated his own people. For a long time, he had been playing the ethnic card with the wars in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains. He was trying to divide the Sudanese people and justify his destructive wars in Darfur, in South Kordofan, also in the Blue Nile. But the economy, particularly after the South Sudan's independence, was left in tatters. And people really struggled for a number of years now to put bread on the table. But it became increasingly worse. It also affected that important middle class, people who had actually profited from the higher oil income. All of us who have been visiting Khartoum during the last 15, 20 years have seen the number of new cars coming on the streets every day. So there was fairly big middle class, mainly located in the capital, having profited from these macroeconomic improvements and from some of the implications of this. But there were no longer jobs for graduates from the universities. The middle class were also struggling. The petrol prices becoming very high, which also affected those who go by bus and so on and so forth. And in December, as you know, public anger boiled over, and people across the Sudan, from all walks of life, and from all ethnic backgrounds took to the streets. Of course, Bashir feared that there would be a coup against him for a long time. So he appointed Ibn Auf, who was also on the US sanctions list. He was not sought after or indicted by the International Criminal Court, which Bashir was because of his involvement in Darfur war. But he was still on this sanctions list, and he was regarded as very loyal to Bashir. And the other one was the former governor Ahmed Haroun, who is also, along with Bashir, indicted by the International Criminal Court. When the pressure escalated, Ibn Auf was appointed vice president and minister of defense, and Ahmed Haroun was made the chair of the National Congress Party. But his fate was sealed when protesters managed to win over the sympathies of mid- and lower-ranking military officers and soldiers as well. And this became very apparent on April 8. Some of the generals saw an opportunity to get rid of a person who had become a liability over many years. It was, of course, a liability to have a president who could not travel freely in the world, but who also was very erratic. Even though they were loyal to him, he was erratic, for example, by going to Moscow as they were trying to deal positively with the Americans. So they seized the opportunity to get rid of him, but it did not mean, however, as we see it today, that they were willing to give up power. Nor did they have the military any agreed plan of succession. But Ibn Auf, after 1 or 2 days, turned out he was not accepted, and this was a second victory by the demonstrators in the streets. He was also tainted very much by his involvement in the Darfur catastrophe. And another one, Burhan, was then appointed as the leader of this military council. The deputy leader was Hemeti. Hemeti, I will come back to, he is a wild card in a way, but Hemeti comes from a rather marginal lineage of the largest Arab tribe in Darfur, the Rizeigat. His lineage derives actually from Chad, but they came into the Sudan some way back. But he managed to rise to the top position of these rapid support forces. As I said, this third armed force in the Sudan. It turned out that Burhan, the new leader of the military council, and Hemeti, were quite close together. Not only related to what was happening in Darfur, but mainly actually the role they played in Yemen, where the Sudanese have been sending soldiers to fight along with the Saudis against Yemen, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So the Burhan and Hemeti are also quite close and have links with Saudi Arabia. Burhan, or just a few words about him, he is the commander of the Sudanese ground forces. He is not considered to be an Islamist, but he comes from the heartland of the elite area. For those of you who know Abdul Ghaffar, who is a professor and affiliated with CMI, Abdul Ghaffar is from that same heartland, the Jaliin, a tribe having dominated Sudanese politics since independence and before independence locally. But also, I must add here, they have their own historian, and he is from Bergen, Anders Bjørkelo, who retired last year. He is the Jali historian. As Shonu Fahi, who died a couple of weeks ago, is the historian of Darfur. Both of them internationally recognized as the authorities on these two regions in Sudan. I will not go very much into these personalities at the moment, but Burhan was he was accepted, but he was like all the generals. He was appointed by Bashir. He was loyal to him before. He was involved with the Janjaweed militia. There is a video of him praising these other forces that the National Islamic Front established already in 1989, called People's Defense Forces, and they were sent to South Sudan to fight the war there. He is just another of these generals. Anyway, on the way to a possible Sudanese revolution, and I think if the Sudanese revolution is achieved, I think it has importance far beyond the Sudan, both in African neighborhood as well as in the Middle East, and that is also something which will make it very difficult to achieve it because of its regional importance. I always used to say that in Addis Ababa they're much more worried about a breakdown in Sudan than they are worried about the breakdown in South Sudan. South Sudan broke down several years ago, 2013, and it's a much worse mess actually than Sudan. But there is a thinking that this can be contained in South Sudan. They are not even terrorists sending people with bombs, and they are not even migrating very much at the moment to Europe or other places. It would be very much different for the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, of course, if Sudan broke down. But also for Sisi, if a new kind of regime took over in Khartoum. There are several hurdles on the way towards the Sudanese revolution, both domestic and foreign. Let me first take the domestic front. There are at least 4 main issues. Donald Trump uses I think he got it from Steve Bannon, I'm sure, deep state. It's a good expression actually, because Sudan has an Islamist deep state. And they have deep patronage networks. They are embedded and cannot be disassembled overnight. As I said, the National Islamic Front and their people took over all the command positions, not only political but also in the Sudanese economy. They are deeply entrenched in that economy. Just to take one example, they managed to destroy the Sudan Gezira scheme south of Khartoum, which was at one point the largest irrigation scheme in the world under one management. An irrigation scheme is a kind of military. It requires some kind of military discipline because you have to cultivate the same crops so that water can come at the same time to the different farmers. But the government gave licenses and contracts to their own people who started cultivating tomatoes and onions and wheat and different things, and the irrigation project system started breaking down. And so they have done with the enormously potential agricultural economy of the Sudan. A lot of dispossession of nomads, land grabbing by foreign powers, and so on and so forth. But they have this deep state, and they are entrenched. They are still controlling it. The state is not controlled by the people in the streets. So this has been a kleptocracy, just like South Sudan has become a kleptocracy. We used to say that Sudan was one, before South Sudan achieved independence, we used to say 1 country, 2 systems, but now people say 2 countries, 1 system. Corruption. And most of you will have read that they found the equivalent of 1 billion Norwegian kroner in Bashir's home. Personally, I don't believe this. I don't think that he was that stupid. I think it was probably placed there by his own people to put the blame on him. He is guilty, we are clean. We also have to remember there have been 30 years of violence in this country. Thousands of people have nothing to lose because they have been so involved in what we, all of us, consider as criminal activities. Violence started already in after 1989, and we have friends who were taken to so-called ghost houses and tortured, let loose, most of them, but in the end, but some of them also killed. You have had the wars in Darfur and other places, of course, in South Sudan. There are lots of violence. Those people have to see, where am I on the other side of a revolution? These thousands. And of course, where am I? I'm going to be killed, or I have to flee the country, or I will at least be imprisoned for a number of years if I manage to survive. You have nothing to lose. The other day, the day before yesterday, the Rapid Support Forces managed to locate in a house enormous amounts of a depot of arms. It doesn't say whom it belongs to, but I'm pretty sure that this belongs to people of the old regime somehow, because we know that there have always been lots of arms in Khartoum, and people have always been worried about a Somali-like situation. And it can still happen. I got worried when on Jazeera on the 11th of April, after Bashir was removed, that people who were interviewed in the streets by Al Jazeera television said, almost all of them, that we will put all these people to court. I think this is a strategic mistake to say when you don't control any arms yourself, but it's very understandable. They all know what's going to happen to them, so it will will make it easier to ask them voluntarily to give up power. But some, they have reached some steps. A third issue is that there is a very fragmented opposition, and therefore exploitable opposition. There are about 100 registered political parties in Sudan these days. Several of them are offshoots of the Islamic regime. People who lost out by some internal power struggle and then established their own parties. Others are old parties, including the Omar party, with leaders, old leaders, who have proved before that they cannot rule the Sudan. And in one case, Sadiq al-Mahdi, who may be the most famous Sudanese politician after Bashir, is making statements these days which will make the revolution more difficult. Because by the statements they are making, they are actually fragmenting further the opposition. There are these forces of the Declaration for Freedom and Change. The military council have agreed that they will talk to them. There is this idea of having a 4-year transition period, which has not yet been accepted. It seems that the response so far that it may be 2 years. But there is a struggle about the composition of any so-called sovereign council on the one hand, a security council on the other hand, and the civilian government, and the composition of the civilians and the military, which I will not go into in any detail because it changes every day. But then there is a fourth issue which is not talked about, but it has been coming from the peripheries. Sudan has been ruled since 1956 as an ethnocracy, as Ali Masri, the famous historian, called it. Ethnocracy means that it has been ruled by a narrow number of ethnic groups. And not by the Darfurians, not by the East Sudanese. but by people coming from 3-4 ethnic groups, the Jalin, the Saigia, the Danagla, the latter being a Nubian group mainly. The only positive things about this at the moment, as I see it, is that a lot of these demonstrators come from this heartland. Actually, it started north of Khartoum in Atbara, which is the old headquarters of the Sudan Railways, where they also had a repair workshop for the trains. That's where the first attack on the National Congress Party headquarters, where they set it on fire and went to the streets before Khartoum. So the way I read this, since the security forces have been recruited to be loyal, they were also recruited from these ethnic groups. And they hesitated to shoot their own. I think if this had been a demonstration from Darfur, or from the border areas with South Sudan, or from Eastern Sudan and so on, these sit-ins would have disappeared a long time ago. Lots of people would have been killed and would have ended there. But because they are from the ethnic heartland, in a way, of the ruling people in Sudan, it becomes more difficult to shoot their own. I have lived in Sudan, and as Ingvild said, I came there in 1970, first time. There were, for many of these years, there were wars in South Sudan, but the Khartoum population, they never saw any coffins coming to Khartoum, because the soldiers were from Darfur and Western Sudan, or from Eastern Sudan. The generals were from Khartoum area, but they didn't die normally in this fighting. So, but the issue of ethnocracy is going to be there for any future government to deal with, because this is an issue which has not been managed at all. On the foreign front, there are some very formidable challenges. I mentioned the Muslim Brothers and Qatar, as it's called in Arabic, Qatar in Norwegian. Qatar is, some will say it's the richest country in the world, because it has these enormous gas deposits in the Gulf, which it shares with Iran. So it has always had to have a reasonable relationship with Iran. But it has also, for a long time, and there are people here in this room knowing more about it than me, but it has had a kind of a positive relationship with the Muslim Brothers. And the Sudan regime in 1989 derives very much from the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's seen by the Egyptians. And Sisi, I think he has 60,000 Muslim brothers in prison as political prisoners after this tragedy where they came to power through an election, Mohamed Morsi, and then there was the Sisi coup, and I think it's 60,000 I've seen at least, they were put to prison, and some of them also facing enormous punishments. Whereas Saudi Arabia then and the Emirates are and with the Egyptians then are enemies of the Muslim Brothers, and Saudi Arabia sees them as a threat, because the Muslim Brothers are an old movement. I think it was founded in 1928 in Egypt, and it is quite well known because by Hassan al-Banna then. But it has this model of political activism combined with charity work. The kind of charity work which we have seen in Gaza by Hamas. Hamas is put on the list of terrorist organization, but when it has some popularity still with the Palestinian, it's very much also because it's doing this charity work, which the Muslim Brothers in Egypt and other places have also been known for. but from 2015 it has been considered a terrorist organization by these countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and significantly perhaps Russia. Russia has branded them as a terrorist organization, Putin. So that is tricky for Egypt. The generals are supposedly, from the Egyptian perspective, Muslim brothers, or at least related to the Muslim brothers. But as much as Sisi may hate the Muslim brothers, he does not want to see, of course, a democratic process or democratic revolution in Sudan. And even more significantly, or at least almost as significantly, he is now the chair of the African Union. The African Union said after Bashir was removed that you got 2 weeks to hand over power to a civilian government. You will know that there was a meeting in Egypt not long after, and the African Union then announced, no, you have 60 days. So that was seen as a clear political signal that, okay, now the African Union may be very much influenced by their chairperson on this issue. We will have to see. But there are mixed signals from the African Union on this. These peace council that they have are still a little bit hard on the Sudanese, giving them a shorter deadline to do something about transiting to a civilian regime. But then there is also Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They have promised $3 billion in aid. I regard it to be a promise to the military council, which they support. They do not, of course, want to see a democratic process in Sudan. Why should they? Sudan is across the Red Sea. It would be regarded as a threat to have a democratic government in Sudan, perhaps started to talk about human rights and things like that. The demonstrators in the streets saying, take your money, they shout. But these are formidable opponents. And there are, of course, many stories of what is happening these days around this. There is, for example, the story of a person called Taha Osman al-Hussein. He was the presidential minister in the Bashir government and director of the presidential office. But then he was dismissed, and he was on his way to the airport to board a plane to Saudi Arabia when he was stopped by the security forces. This was last year. But then he got the word in the airport that he was dismissed. That's the story. But then they allowed him to embark the plane. And he went to Riyadh, and he became the African affairs advisor to the Saudi government. The rumor is that he is now in the Saudi embassy in Khartoum. He is a character. Another stubborn story about him is that he offered the Saudis to help them carry out a coup in Qatar. There was also a rumor that he actually tried to make a coup in Khartoum in 2017. But people seem not to believe that story. But now there is a rumor that he is sitting in the Saudi embassy in Khartoum, and the Saudi refused to receive a petition from the demonstrators, the forces, which was handed over to all the embassies in Khartoum. about what should be done, the importance of having a transition to a civilian government. The only embassy which refused to receive this letter was the Saudi embassy. Then we have the two leaders, Burhan and Hemeti. It's easy to say that, well, they've got all their money from the Saudis. They sent the soldiers. They have been involved in Yemen adventure. It seems that the rapid support forces, these old Janjaweed, are controlling much of military situation in Khartoum. As I said, they discovered this depot of arms just 2 days ago. But they have also, after April 11, they control all the bridges across the Nile, as you see from the Nile, the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet at Khartoum, and there are lots of bridges, and the rapid support forces control these bridges. The Americans have come out saying that the chargé d'affaires, they don't have an ambassador, have come out saying that Hemeti is not wanted by anybody. And that anything that, if he is tainted, it should be sorted out locally. So the Americans clearly doesn't have anything against him. He is the only one in the military council without any military education at all, actually, according to Sharif Harir, who has been here before talking about Sudan, an old PhD from the University of Bergen, anthropologist. He has no education. Maybe he went to the Khalwa, this Quran school, but it's not even certain that he went to the Khalwa. He is from Darfur, a nomadic family, no education, no military education, but he is a kind of a wild card at the moment, clearly close to the Gulf, clearly having a kind of military position in charge of his troops, with his army possibly in a disarray because the mid-level officers sided with the people in the streets, so the generals may not be certain about loyalties in the army. So I think he's going to be an important figure. But of course, people like Sharif coming from Darfur, they all hate him. They see him as being behind much of the violence in Darfur. He is an Arab behind this Janjaweed. So he tainted is a very mild word. And now, of course, some of you will have read yesterday that Trump, our old friend, is being convinced maybe by Sisi and the Saudis, I'm sure. The Israelis love this. To brand the Muslim Brothers as a terrorist organization. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories, of course, here too. And one of them is that what is happening in Libya these days is also interesting in this perspective, because there is a fighting for the capital and for controlling Libya. At the moment, this is very uncertain what will happen. But the forces of Khalifa Haftar, who's now attacking Libya, are supported by who? Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. In this case, it's even a little bit more complicated, but it seems that France is also behind. There is great uncertainty what to do in Libya. But there is this ideal, according to some people, that Egypt would very much like to have a kind of a military dictatorship crescent around itself, and that the Saudis would also like to see military authoritarian regimes being in charge along this crescent, and forming some kind of protection for their own future. I think that banning the Muslim Brothers, and we are talking about millions of people here, there are also a lot of them in Western countries, of course. banning them from participating openly in the political process, I think is not only terribly wrong, but I think it's also terribly short-sighted. Because it would not only push many brothers, Muslim brothers, underground, but it would also strengthen violent jihadist groups. Not only, I think, in the Sahel area and other places in the Middle East, but it will, of course, prove to them that the West sees all Muslims as terrorists and Islam as a threat. Because that's what you're telling the world, in a way. So I will stop there because it's been too long already. But at the moment, just the last few sentences, at the moment I'm not sure whether to be optimistic or not. I'm not very optimistic about the outcome. I hope, because I hope sincerely that I'm wrong, that there will be a real revolution. I think that there is a problem with the opposition, that they have not structured the leadership properly. I see that there is a change of persons coming to these negotiations with the military council. That is very dangerous. They don't have a leadership structure. Some of the leaders are abroad. They are not in Sudan. And I think also, given the fact that Sudan is bankrupt, given the fact that there is no government now since April 11, that means not only that that should be fine with these Islamists and so on, but it means that it's difficult to get food. And the Khartoum people, they always get along. They get food. They even get petrol. But in the provinces, there is real supply problems. And now the voices come. Are you fighting your revolution for the Khartoum elite? Is it another elite phenomenon? Or are you fighting on behalf of us? Even though the slogans in the street had said that we are all Darfurians, saying that we are fighting for all of us. This is coming up now as an issue. So I think that given this, given the bankruptcy of Sudan, given the position of the entrenched deep state, and the fact that the arms are not with the demonstrators, I think that it's some kind of compromise is called for. And some kind of compromise will be able to move the process over time in a positive direction. I think if that doesn't succeed, I think that we are in for a backlash, a possible backlash. And this is where I hope I'm completely wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gunnar. Any questions? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Gunnar, for a very interesting presentation. I was wondering about the Sudan Professional Association and the role of it in the protests. They have apparently been very prominent. What's the character of this movement, and what's the ethnic profile of it, and what links does it have to the established elites?
I think that I don't know all the details. I just noticed that several of those having been interviewed on international TV channels are sitting in places like London, and I know from Mansour and Abdel Ghaffar, and I must add that both Mansour and Abdel Ghaffar are involved in kind of trying to promote dialogue. Abdel Ghaffar is sort of a grand old man of Sudanese social science, so he has kind of position there. They are not very optimistic at the moment. I got mails from them yesterday from Mansour. And Mansour's main point is that the Sudan Professionals Association, they haven't come out now after this first victories. One victory to get rid of Bashir, the second to get rid of the first leader of the military council. They are not properly structured in terms of leadership. And they changed people going into the negotiations. They made a manifesto which they seem not to believe in themselves any longer because it was sloppy. And Sadiq al-Mahdi from the Omar party is making statements to the effect that we all have to sit down and agree and so on. And now you think 100 Sudanese political parties, fighting groups in Darfur and Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile and so on, sit down and agree. That is the same as telling the military council you can just rule Sudan. And that is of course tricky. Of course you have to make some agreements, but how do you do that with that kind of repression, 30 years of repression? All trade unions and so on with broken backs, universities with broken backs. To rise this has been enormously impressive that they have achieved so much, but now is the moment. And I fear that this, I hope not, but I fear there will be a failure.
Thank you. I believe I was lucky enough to get the next question. So my question is that do you foresee any kind of legislative changes in Sudan with the changes of the regime and to which direction? And I'm asking this question in particularly when it comes to human rights and women's position in the country. To my understanding, the current Sudanese legislation necessitates at least 3 eyewitnesses for a woman who has been raped in order to claim her rights.
I think that there is definitely a lot of Sudanese who are now concerned with such issues. It's not on the first and second, third on the agenda at the moment, but you will have noticed, for example, also that there was a great number of women, female demonstrators persistently in the streets. And not only that these were recruited from students and middle class, but actually tea ladies and poor women from all classes took part. So there is an awareness of these legislative issues, and there is also concern from women that they are not even sitting at the table yet. So there is a concern that we should not lose out, and these are also on these human rights issues. But I haven't seen any elaboration on anything yet. I haven't, but it will have to come if we get some positive changes.
One question on related to South Sudan. What, in your view, are the likely implications of what's happening in Khartoum on the war and peace processes in South Sudan?
Very interesting question. Actually, the funny thing is that Salva Kiir, who is in himself a deep mess, the president of South Sudan, he volunteered to mediate in Sudan, help to make peace in Sudan. I think the big issue that we had a seminar in the Norwegian People's Aid on both countries just after Easter, and those who spoke on South Sudan, they asked me, the main question they asked is what happened to Riek Machar? Riek Machar, who is going to Juba at one point. He is detained in Khartoum, actually, as the partner to the new revised agreement on South Sudan. There was a rumor that he tried to flee Khartoum after Bashir lost his power, but I think it's only a rumor. He said himself that he was just going to town to buy some goods. It seems that he's kept under, that the military are still aware of him, and that this is an issue that they have to be concerned with. That he is still detained. One could think that maybe they are so concerned with so many other issues that he would be free to leave. But it has Sudan and Uganda, are the guarantors in a way for this new revised agreement, which on South Sudan, which nobody believes will promote peace in Sudan. And Mamdani, the Ugandan social scientist, said that South Sudan is now protectorate belonging to Uganda and Sudan. They will dominate it economically. The Ugandans are still very much active in the economy around Juba particularly. But the Sudanese capital and investments and so on and so forth are also very important. So in Juba, there are also a lot of people, of course, who believe that this would have a positive effect on political developments in South Sudan. But it's very difficult to say whether this will, how this will play out at the moment. I think it depends very much on the outcome. But it's significant, I think, that Salva Kiir more or less said explicitly, we support the military council. And then he went to Abu Dhabi, to the Emirates. So here is the money. He gets also money from Abu Dhabi, I'm sure. So he supports the military council. They don't want a democracy in Sudan.
Yeah, thank you for this very insightful presentation. I have two questions actually regarding the influence of actors. So, for instance, the religious leadership in Sudan. Usually religious leaders can often sustain peace processes and revolutions. Do they have some moderating role, and if so, on which side do you see them standing? And the second question is about the impact of China, who is also like economically and politically involved in Sudan. What is their stance towards what's going on currently?
Yeah, on religious leadership, I have not seen them playing a big role at the moment these days, and that is, of course, because this is not an anti-Islamic revolution, of course. Most of those industries are Muslim or or some kind of secular orientation, but it's definitely not anti-Islamic. And but at the same time, the government has been identified with the Islamists who have played their role and played it very badly. So at the moment they don't have they don't seem to have a big role. Other religious leaders as well. I don't see any of these Sufi leaders or any of these. The Khatmiya Sufi sect, which is traditionally prominent in Sudan, I don't see them as big players. There was another rumor, by the way, yesterday that this Taha Osman, whom I mentioned, sitting in the Saudi embassy, that he had become one of the leaders of the old Democratic Unionist Party, and the rumor then said that this was just one step from then taking over as the new prime minister or president of Sudan. But so these rumors are widely circulating. China is of course there also in South Sudan. The Chinese have built all the bridges and many of the roads. But Bashir went to China and tried to get relief, debt relief. I don't think he succeeded. He went to many countries to try to get relief. But I think at the same time, of course, they don't want to... They are there, but they seem to keep a low profile, just waiting to see what happens. They are positioned. They also have old Chinese who have been there for years, speaking Arabic and being involved in the Sudanese economy on different points. I just mentioned that this regional, it was interesting that on the 1st of April, Qatar Airways stopped all flights to Khartoum. And that is 11 days before Bashir was removed. And that, of course, was a clear signal that Qatar supported Sudan with billions. And they supported Darfur peace process and lots of things in Sudan. 1st of April, they stopped flying. And that, of course, meant that now they are out, and the Saudi had pushed the Sudanese government to stop any links with Sudan. And one undersecretary lost his job because he told the media that they were planning a meeting with the Qatari delegation. He immediately lost the job. So, and that was before Bashir lost his position.
Yeah, you say that the sort of neighboring countries are not interested in democracy in Sudan, but are there any international actors that are interested in democracy in Sudan? And I particularly would ask the question in relation to the EU and the Khartoum process and the fact that Sudan is a transit country for migrants into Europe. So, and then would re-ask Louise's question a little bit, because I'm curious about it. Do you know anything about the ethnic profile of the Sudan Professional Association? Because you didn't.
I think on this last issue, I think that maybe Huwaida, who's here, know more about, but you can say that. But no, I wrote in Bergenstien yesterday a small chronique on Europe's new border guards and the new border guards here in these three countries on the borders with Libya. And of course, I agree with what you're saying, that the European Union will not. Of course, they are concerned, but they are not going to engage very much, I think, in this process of promoting democracy. We will see. The Norwegian ambassador to Khartoum is coming here tomorrow, so we will hear more about that. But when I posted this chronique on my Facebook, I got there was a professor in Trondheim. He said that the reason why this is not being talked about in Europe, about these border guards, which are actually militias profiting from migration. They stop some, they smuggle others, and they profit a lot from European funds. And we are not terribly concerned about it in Europe. And he said that that is because Europe still want to have a humanitarian image. So we can complain about Trump building a wall against Mexico, but we will not be concerned with these uncomfortable issues, what's happening in the Sahel area, which may be a part of the story.
Thank you very much, Gunnar, and thank you all very much for coming. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, Global Bergen. And I want you to know that all our events are streamed, so you can watch them on YouTube. Three more events this week. One, when is the worst time to die? Tomorrow. And one on preventing Palestine. And on Friday, there's a seminar on Yemen. So, welcome back. Have a nice day.